everybody. Welcome back to the Latched Mama Podcast. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Latched Mama Podcast is the podcast for the mothers in the trenches of motherhood. Today, we are going to continue our two-part series on your legal rights in the workplace when you are pregnant and breastfeeding. We are going to talk about your rights when you come back to work to express breast milk and all of that stuff. You're listening to Latched Mama Podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Wirt, busy mom of 6 and owner of LatchedMama.com. Join us each week as we talk about pregnancy, breastfeeding, postpartum, and all things motherhood. Hey, Leah, would you like to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure, Melissa. I'm a management side employment attorney, been practicing about 8 years. Help employers in all different industries, whether it's manufacturing, healthcare, schools, retail establishments, help them navigate different workplace issues from accommodations to harassment, discrimination, workplace violence, pretty much anything that happens in the workplace, and life happens in the workplace, I like to say.
Yes, you do, and it does, for sure. So we get a lot of questions in the Facebook group about rights when women come back to work in terms of pumping and expressing breast milk and things like that and accommodations. It's always very surprising to me to learn that a lot of people don't know exactly what their rights are. They don't really know what they're allowed to ask for, what they're not allowed to ask for. It's really sad to me when they're afraid to ask for anything because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. It's all just really, really hard because I think ultimately everything that we're talking about this week as well as last week really comes down to hoping that employers are just good human beings. But sometimes from the stories I have heard from you, people sometimes choose profit over their actual people. So today we wanted to kind of educate you all a little bit on what you can ask for, what is required by an employer to provide for you when you come back to the workplace after you have a baby. And hopefully Leah will share some stories with us as well to make you a little bit less awkward to ask for, what you need. So Give us kind of an overview. I know the new Pump Act has not gone into effect yet. That's going to go in, right?
The Pump Act did go into effect in December.
Okay. So the Pump Act is in effect now.
Sure. So we're talking lactation.
We're gonna talk lactation, and I know you have some terms for us that you have learned.
No, I threw them out in podcast 1.
Okay.
Go back and listen to part 1 for these terms. All right. So in terms of nursing, an employer is required to provide reasonable break time to employees to express milk, as well as a reasonable location that's shielded from view and free from intrusion.
So a locked door.
Arguably. I mean, but the law says, in terms of certain guidance, a locked door or even a sign, like a stop-go type sign, if that's going to be create free from intrusion. I would say it's really not that burdensome to put a lock on a door.
Okay, so what else? So it has to be a room that nobody else can come into.
Correct. And now this is more recent. I mean, in 2010, basically the wage and hour law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, was amended to say that employees who were entitled to overtime, so think these are more your hourly employees, that they were entitled to break times. So the reason that it was called break times for nursing mothers, essentially, it came about in a wage and hour law, which is really a weird place to find it, but it was because it was really all about the break time.
Okay.
And it's basically said that these employees were entitled to the same thing, reasonable break time to express milk when needed.
Paid breaks?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
We'll certainly talk about that. And that they were entitled to a certain location. It was, you just mentioned the pump law, which was passed this past year, and this just recently expanded it to all employees. So
for a really long time, and this was something that was questioned all the time in our group, and people didn't understand because we celebrated it when the Pump Act was passed, and people were like, "You're wrong. Those rights have been around for a while." And we were trying to explain to people that a lot of your salaried employees throughout the country were not given those same rights. Like there were a lot of teachers and nurses who were like, we're not allowed. Like, I don't have the time. Like, I'm not given the time to go pump.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that just kind of like slipped in and wasn't even discussed, I feel like.
And I think I think it was inadvertently, and it was an inadvertent mistake by Congress because they added it into that sort of that overtime section of the Fair Labor Standards Act. I do think most employers, once they got into compliance with that, many employers went ahead and created nursing rooms, and they opened it up to all employees. And so in effect, I think it did impact, it had a greater impact than really all that was required under the law. That said, yeah, from terms of what was actually required, we were only got teeth added to that law recently.
So I've recently had a baby, let's just say hypothetically, and I'm coming back to work. I should have, like, are there rules for companies who are not required to offer this space to women?
Meaning are there exceptions?
Are
to
there
the law?
exceptions? Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, that was not legalish enough for Leah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, now the law would apply to all employers, but you can arguably say if it's an undue hardship and you have less than 50 employees, that you could escape compliance. It also doesn't apply to like airline workers. Okay. Now that's going to come into place. I think that's phased in to happen maybe 2025, 2026.
Okay.
But no, yeah. So there are exceptions. I would say I've never actually in effect seen someone rely on those exceptions because it's really not that hard to comply with this law. I mean, if you think about it, so giving someone, how long would a woman on average need to express milk during the workday? Let's say 8-hour workday. How long does a woman need to express milk?
3 30-minute breaks, I would say.
30 minutes.
30 to, I mean, it's really the problem. And this is what happens so much in these conversations is that it's a biological process. So you actually have to let down. So your milk has to let down and the oxytocin has to happen. It's this whole like biological process.
Let down meaning
that the milk has to, like, hormones have to interact with one another to come together to make the actual milk come out of the breast. You can't just put breast pump on your breast and expect milk to come out whether there's milk in your breast or not. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. So how do you know?
So that's what I'm saying. So like to put this all in like the legal world, which we always kind of laugh about, it takes something that is a biological process and it tries to put it inside of a box, which is a little bit harder to do because for some women, you know, they only want to pump once a day because their kid's 6 months old and they had enough leave to go back then. I mean, some women literally need to pump every 2 hours because that's how their body reacts to it. Right. And you get into all of these like really difficult things to navigate. You have, you know, children who can't take formula, or you have a woman who literally is an overproducer and needs to be on the pump every 2 hours, or they'll get mastitis, which literally can lead to death if it's not treated. So, I mean, there's all different sorts of like things that can happen in the process.
Well, see, and people like you are not making these laws.
Oh, I know.
And I think that's the problem, right? Yeah. And many employers are not run by Latched Mama.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And so, yeah, the law, it's very basic. It says provide reasonable break time. Okay. Now, what is reasonable? There's no limit on that. Not 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
So it's subjective.
It is. Absolutely. What is reasonable? It's going to be a case-by-case situation. Basically, what does the employee do? Let's talk about the workplace. But also talking about the biological elements associated with this as well. I think that has to be factored into the equation. An employer has to provide a certain location. It cannot be a bathroom. Okay. It has to be free from intrusion, like I mentioned. And an employer only has to do it for up to a year after the child's birth, which I recently found out. A colleague of mine was saying that many women are now breastfeeding until 2 years.
Well, what's interesting is the APA came out and said, hey, you should breastfeed your babies, or the baby should be provided breast milk for 2 years. But then you have a law that says, hey, we're only going to give you the right to do it in the workplace for the first, year. Yeah. So it's so contradictory. And it's like, what direction do you go? And are we being seen? And it's just this whole big process of, let's not tell these women by this association of because everybody wants what's best for their kids. So if a doctor says, hey, whole doctor organization says, hey, we really think that you should be doing this for 2 years.
Right.
But then the laws say, but hold on, we're only going to give you time to do it at work for a year. You start this like shame spiral that's like already part of motherhood to begin with. And it just turns into this whole big thing.
I mean, the laws are not catching up to science quick enough.
Yeah.
Or medical advice, I guess, is what the issue is. So
it's just, it's fascinating to me. So
reasonable break time.
Yeah. And what I would love to stress from kind of the employer side of this, and this is not the legal side of this, is just because somebody has done something before when you come back. So let's say Sally came back to work and she only needed to nurse twice a day, or she only needed to breastfeed twice a day, and she was happy with the accommodations. But you come back and you're like, you know what? It would be really nice if there was a mini fridge in here, or it would be really nice if I could take, 5 breaks, but have them be shorter, or this is what I need, blah, blah, blah. Don't be afraid to have that conversation with your employer. I don't know what you can tell me from like a legal side, if you can ask for an accommodation and they can fire you for rocking the boat. But that is what we see all the time in the group, is that people are so afraid to even ask for what they need because they're so afraid to lose their job. But they have some protection, correct?
Absolutely. You should not be afraid to lose your job. These laws also have anti-retaliation protections, which means you cannot be retaliated against, demoted, because you ask for essentially the opportunity to breastfeed or to express milk in the workplace. And we could talk about sort of breastfeeding versus expressing milk. The law does not say that you have a right to, quote, bring your baby into the workplace to actually breastfeed. No, the law says you have a right to express milk. So again, are there different benefits to actually breastfeeding versus a bottle?
Well, there's some babies who aren't going to take a bottle,
I actually had this come up.
Really?
Yeah. So had a client, they kind of had like an event space, and they had an employee who gave tours of the event space. So imagine a couple wants to come in and have a wedding. So we want to see this event space. The employee had a baby. The baby was not refusing a bottle. And the employee also at the same time was suffering some postpartum depression. So you had that sort of element of a medical
like
condition.
Not wanting to be away from their baby probably too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think part of it was, if I remember correctly, the employee was stressed out about the baby not taking a bottle, because this mom is coming back to work after taking some time off and leaving her baby in the hands of, I think it might have been the grandmother, during the workday.
Yeah, this is a very typical situation.
Yeah. Okay. So, and so she basically came to the employer and said, can I have, 45 minutes to go home a couple times a day and nurse? Well, whether that's a reasonable break time, that was kind of hard to factor in. And the employer,
it's a lot of time.
Yeah. And the law doesn't say an employer has to give her that. But there were a couple of factors. I think the medical condition also played into it, but we ultimately worked out a scenario where because from an operational standpoint, they couldn't just stop tours. They had tours scheduled at certain times a day. They tried to modify the schedule a little bit, but they ultimately said, look, just giving her the baseline of the law, which was, hey, you can go into this room and express milk on these, during this time, that wasn't going to work for her situation. So they ultimately worked out a way where to keep her break time about the same, but the grandmother brought the baby to the workplace, which again,
I love a happy ending.
Yeah, it's not required. And then they also worked on accommodations in terms of providing counseling. Yeah. I think lactation support and counseling as well. And
we talked about that on the last podcast, and we're going to step away really quickly from lactation because I think it is just such an important thing to double down on. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ADA stuff that can kick in after you have the baby? So like if you are going back to work, you have postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, you can ask for accommodations. You can potentially meet with your employer and say, hey, while I've been on maternity leave, I've been really anxious. I've been working with a therapist. I would really like to have an extended lunch break once a week, or take an hour, once a week to, do some online therapy or whatever. like you can ask that question.
Absolutely.
And you have a legal right, hopefully, for that accommodation.
Right. And you would have rights to be accommodated. Again, it's a reasonable accommodation. So what does that entail? It's an interactive process. It's back and forth. It's case by case. It's subjective, a little bit objective too. But I mean, you have that right, and you also have anti-retaliation protections. So you have a right to go ahead and ask for that accommodation and not be worried about losing your job. And I mean, the same is true in the lactation context too. I mean, I think, if an employee needs certain time to express milk, and I'll give you another example. So employee was a bus driver for a college campus, and she needed, the employer found out that she was using a handheld breast pump to pump while driving.
So not even an automatic breast pump, just a...
No, okay, electronic. Maybe I got it wrong. Darn, see, I should have done better Googling. No, but I'm trying to remember the scenario from about a year ago. So the employer found out that she was just went ahead and did this because in her defense, she was fearful that I'm coming back to work.
Yep.
She didn't know what her rights were. And
so she was pumping and driving the
She
school
was
bus
pumping and driving a bus for college kids.
Okay.
And
which is really not that abnormal. Like pumping and driving, done it multiple times, but it's fine.
Is it? Do you advocate for that on the podcast?
I'm not advocating for pumping and driving. I think pumping and driving done correctly. Like my best friend from college would pump on her commute every day, and that was just when she found the time to pump.
Is it safe? Like, describe to me what's happening in this.
I mean, there's hands-free pumps now, so I don't understand any reason why you wouldn't be able to hands-free pump and drive. I mean, the only thing that I really could think of is like a cord getting in the way while you're driving. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know if there were like safety laws against it. I can't imagine there would be. I mean,
can tell
maybe
you there's no like expressly written safety law against it, but I mean,
nothing's happening. I mean, you're a little blissed out. I mean,
so
you're
what
a little
happened?
like,
so okay, you're driving down the highway, and now this is what I do with my clients, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out
absolutely, because you have to learn all of these certain things, especially not being a mom and not doing it before.
And also, employees should know that you also have a right to work with bring your medical provider into the situation too. Don't hesitate to get your medical provider on board if you need some kind of reasonable accommodation to also work with the employer and educate the employer, because you might have an employer like me who's sitting here saying, what is a hands-free device and how is that not dangerous? I mean, when so the bottles are full, can they fall off? Can they?
I mean they're screwed on to the bottom of the flanges is what they're called, which is what goes like over your nipples. I mean, the only thing that I can truly think about, I mean, maybe if the pump stopped and the piece fell off and you went to look for it, you could crash. I can't imagine that it's really that unsafe. I mean, there's a bunch of oxytocin flowing, so you're kind of probably a little bit sleepier. But I mean, is that bus driver allowed to smoke weed at work and drive the bus?
Yeah.
I mean,
whoa, she threw a wrench in this hypo.
I mean, we can go back and forth. I mean, if that's allowed in the workplace, I can't imagine pumping is not.
Yeah. So in this case, the employer called. They said, should we write her up? Because they got a complaint from someone on the bus who was kind of, I guess, concerned about maybe safety, but also like just the awkwardness this individual felt. I can't remember exactly what the
of somebody doing
said.
what their body naturally needed to do to feed their offspring.
Yeah, if you put it like that.
Okay,
yeah,
just letting you know. Okay,
that's why you never want Melissa on your jury. You have to come for these scenarios. You have to come out of the context of latched mama.
I get it, but
but
here's the deal.
Employer.
I will go double down with you on the fact that there could be a safety aspect there, a tiny one.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to double down on the fact that somebody should be written up for somebody else feeling awkward about somebody pumping on a bus.
No, and we won't. Let's ignore the awkward aspect, right? So it comes to the employer. Yes, I think we have to consider there could be a safety concern.
Because you're multitasking while you're driving other people.
Absolutely.
I get it.
And right. And you've got kids on this bus.
Yeah,
an employer,
I got it.
Yeah. And there's a negligence concern. Okay.
Okay.
All right. We're good. We're on board.
The same time.
We're on board.
What was the said solution here?
So you cannot, we had to advise this client, look, you can't write this employee up because again, first off, this employee doesn't even know their rights, that they're entitled to an opportunity, reasonable break time to express
because they haven't disclosed the rights to said employee.
Yeah, this
is it the employer's responsibility to make sure the employee knows their rights?
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I mean, from a federal standpoint, I mean, it's usually you're going to see it in your employee handbook or maybe on some kind of intranet site. If you don't see that, certainly ask your employer. But and in some states, you're actually once an employer is aware that an employee is pregnant, the employer is supposed to give a notice to the employee of their rights. But that's not all states. So yeah, so I mean, you've got that anti-retaliation protection. So in this case, this employee was not abusing the system. They're trying to work. I mean, there was no bad bone in her body. She's trying to work, and she was like, how can I meet the needs of my child and get my job done and get a paycheck? And part of that, and so there's absolutely, writing her up would not make sense. Then the question was, well, we can't just stop the bus route for her to take a break because, I mean, you've got that. How many people does that impact on campus? They're going to class. We can't change the bus routes. So then really the question was, okay, can we transfer her to another position? They did have another sort of dispatch position, but it was a lesser wage. So then the question was, can we put her in there and with the reduced wage? What do you think?
I say no. I say if you put her in that position, you have to pay her the current wage that she was being paid as a bus driver.
Absolutely. Yeah. That goes to sort of that, I mean, anti-retaliation. So that would arguably be a demotion. So the retaliation doesn't just protect you.
Because you can't demote somebody for wanting to express breast milk when you can't provide them with the law states, which is a break. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, and she could get certain breaks. I mean, that was part of this back and forth with the client, right? Is, okay, well, does she really not take a break for 8 hours? Like, when does she use the restroom or something like that? And so we ultimately worked out sort of I think it was like she worked a 4-hour shift driving the bus. And then at that point, she did 4 hours of dispatch. And she was able to use a particular room, you know, to nurse.
Was she happy with that?
You know, I'm not usually privy to whether or not
what
the
happened.
employee is happy.
That's sad. You don't get the end.
Sad?
You don't get the end of the story.
I mean, I think, you know, from these accommodations, I mean, they're temporary in nature. So, like you said, I mean, up to a year.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think the moral of the story is to A, know that you have rights, and B, to advocate for yourself, which is so hard in that postpartum period, especially when you're like trying to navigate your relationship with your baby and how you're feeling and how you're kind of a new person. And are you going to be seen the same way at work if you ask for these things? And, you know, coming from an employer standpoint, and I know you keep saying that I'm latched mama, so I come from like this completely like different place, but like, know that you're a freaking badass. Like when you go back to work after you've just had a baby and you're willing to try and find the time to feed said baby by pumping and still do your job, like that's a badass move in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And you know, use that voice and use that to ask and advocate for what you want. And like I said, if somebody before you needed something different, that doesn't mean that your needs aren't important as well. And
address what you inherently feel is wrong. I mean, you know, I mean, because I think oftentimes it can be an ignorant manager who just doesn't know what rights you're entitled to. And so you might have to have that uncomfortable conversation. I had a client call and they had a female employee complained because her manager was timing her for how long she was nursing during her breaks. So
she was pumping and
the manager was timing her and saying, oh, that was 18 minutes. Oh, that was 22 minutes. Hey, 20-minute break. Like, hey, and you look shocked right now.
I'm shocked just because we go backwards to that biological process of some days, like it's not going to work as fast.
But the law doesn't say you're entitled to a break time as long as your biological process needs. The law says you're just entitled to a reasonable break time.
But who is deciding what is reasonable?
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's a difficult situation. It's got to be.
So this employer decided that it was a 20-minute break.
Yeah, well, okay. So generally speaking, breaks under 20 minutes are paid. And in this case, the employer provided 2 20-minute breaks throughout the day. And
that were paid.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Now you go beyond that, we're getting into other scenarios. But the issue that this employee had, she was like, look, I'll get it done in 20 minutes.
Can I just comment really fast too?
Sure.
On the whole nother aspect of this law that like really isn't taken in consideration? Because if you're literally saying to me, you have to pump in 20 minutes, like, who's washing those pump parts? When are those pump parts getting washed? I guess they're getting washed at home. I don't know. I've never had to pump on a schedule like that. But just the idea to know that you're on the clock, if you were to study the biological process at all, it's kind of like if you think about birth. All the studies have been said that like the oxytocin and all the different hormones that come in with the bright lights and in a clinical setting and in a hospital, or if you start labor at home and it's going really well and then you transfer to a hospital, all of the biological processes stop because stress and your flight response kicks in. It's like why you watch animals in the wild and they're in labor and then all of a sudden like a lion comes and they're able to stop having their baby until they're safe again. Same type of thing. So if you tell a woman, hey, you've got 20 minutes and I'm timing you, she's not going to be able to express breast milk.
Yeah. I guess her cortisol levels would spike where
absolutely.
No, and again, the law doesn't say exactly 20 minutes. It says reasonable break time. So if that's happening to you, I would bring that forward. And this employee did. And in fact, she compared it to the fact that the manager was not timing a male employee, a coworker of hers, who was taking more than 20 minutes to go to the bathroom, to poop. Right. So she is being held to a different standard at that point. I'd say arguably
me so angry.
She has some kind of, discrimination claim. Right. We're both taking. I mean, if at that point, if you can point to another employee in your workplace who's taking longer than a 20-minute break.
Yep.
To go to the bathroom.
Is there a poop protection? Is there poop protection
if you
by
had
the law?
some kind of like
medical
IBS or
you
something,
do like an interactive process on that to
right.
figure out how often you need to use the restroom.
How often do you talk about poop in your podcasts? Because
so what happened? So she put in a complaint, and then you were on the employer
side, right? Helping the employer navigate this situation.
Did you just have to talk to some stupid man and just say like, dude, what you're doing is ridiculous right now? I mean, I've heard you have these conversations with people where you're just like, dude.
I'm not easy on my clients. No, I will tell you that. But no, generally speaking, I think the client was more concerned. Oh my gosh, is she going to file a lawsuit? Like, what are we doing wrong? Can we time her? Whoa, Melissa.
I understand, but like we don't need to be timing. We don't need to
Why
be
don't
timing.
we try to get people into compliance?
I understand. I'm not saying that. I'm just like.
Yeah, I mean, talk about the stress of that. Okay. So yeah, in this case, we're working it out. I mean, it's you have to ask questions back and say, okay, is it really an unreasonable break time to take 30 minutes or 35 minutes for her if she needs additional time when you've got this guy over here pooping for 30 minutes? Right. I think that arguably then at that what is reasonable in that workplace would be whatever time he's allowed to go take to poop. So, and the other part of this too is, even if let's say that you give her, let's say you try to work it out. You give her 4 40-minute breaks, which is a fair amount of time during the workday.
Yep.
So at that point, the employer is like, okay, from a hardship standpoint, oh gosh, like these last 2 breaks, we just can't make them paid. I mean, the employee has to be completely relieved of duty. So I think Department of Labor gives an example where a school teacher is nursing and she starts pumping. I mean, she starts grading papers while pumping.
Yeah. So,
that's not relieved of duty. That's compensable time at that point. Okay. So, I think my takeaway is, in these types of situations, employees really have some leeway, but you've got to be comfortable going to the employer and saying, and if you get stopped at like your immediate manager level, go to the next level, keep pushing it, because like you said, I mean, that situation has not come up yet about having to clean the devices.
Yeah. So what is paid and what is not paid? What does the law state in terms of these breaks being paid?
Yeah. And that's a good question. So generally speaking, from a wage and hour standpoint, the breaks under 20 minutes are considered paid.
Okay.
30 minutes and more, you're talking, lunch. Generally speaking, lunch break can be unpaid, but you'd really have to be totally relieved of duty. And I think that's hard because people are often, depending on what you do,
you're on your phone or you're doing something while you're pumping.
Absolutely. You're sitting there and you're pumping and you're checking your email.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, these laws are temporary. I mean, they're in place for a temporary period of time they provide those protections temporarily. Sorry. So, I would say my general advice to employers is it's all paid.
Yeah. So pay it, get through that. first year or however long. Question though, does anybody ever like just say they're pumping for that first year and go take those breaks in a way? I mean, I would assume that people do.
So it's funny you say that, because this is actually not from a client, but a friend of mine was complaining to me because she was like, Leah, I need to know the laws around this. And I was like, are you pregnant? Like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, is this your way of telling me you're pregnant?
Yeah.
Like, this is how my friends advise me.
Yeah.
She was like, no, but like all the women in my workplace, they've just like commandeered the break room and they watch like some kind of soap or opera at a certain period of time, and they're all claiming they're nursing in there, and I feel excluded. And I was like, oh man. Well, no, yeah, you
Are they really pumping, or they're just using?
Yeah, and that's the idea that, like, I think you hear these stories of people sort of abusing the system,
Yeah.
and that those stories can
It's
ruin
going to
it for
happen with
everybody.
literally every single workplace rule and law and accommodation. Like, you've got to hope that the people who need it use it, and the rest of it is just kind of, I feel like, the cost of doing business sometimes. You know, you just try and
Yeah.
do the right thing and keep moving forward. Cool. Thank
Yeah.
you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for being here, Leah. If you guys
Thanks for
have any
having me.
other questions regarding, I don't know, employment and rights and all that stuff, send us an email. We'd love to have Leah back, maybe. We'll see.
Maybe.